Have you ever wondered why some investigators crack cases that others couldn't even begin to understand? Or how certain professionals seem to uncover hidden truths when everyone else is looking in the wrong direction? Today, I'm going to share with you the essential investigation tips and tricks that will transform the way you approach problem solving, decision making, and uncovering the truth in any situation. Whether you're a professional investigator, a journalist, a researcher, a student, or simply someone who wants to develop critical thinking skills that will serve you throughout your entire life. The world around us is filled with information, misinformation, and hidden details that only those with trained eyes can see. And what separates the truly effective investigators from everyone else isn't luck or intuition alone, but rather a systematic approach combined with practical techniques that have been refined and tested over decades of real-world application. Before we dive into these transformative techniques, I want you to understand that investigation isn't just about finding facts. It's about understanding the deeper story behind those facts. It's about connecting dots that others haven't even noticed. And it's about developing the kind of intellectual discipline that allows you to see beyond the obvious and into the hidden layers of truth that most people completely overlook. The first and perhaps most crucial tip that every serious investigator must master is the art of asking the right questions. And this is where most amateur investigators fail, because they either ask surface-level questions that yield surface-level answers, or they ask leading questions that confirm what they already believe rather than opening doors to new understanding. When you're investigating anything from a business problem to a historical event to a personal matter, you need to begin with completely open-ended questions that force you to think deeply about what you actually know versus what you're assuming. For example, instead of asking, "Did the suspect commit the crime?" which is a yes or no question that already assumes guilt or innocence, you should be asking, "What do we know about the circumstances surrounding this event?" Or, "What gaps exist in the timeline that we've been provided?" Or, "Who benefits from this particular outcome?" These questions don't presuppose an answer. Instead, they create space for discovery and exploration. I recommend using the classic investigative framework known as the 5 W's and 1 H. Who was involved? What exactly happened? When did it occur? Where did it take place? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? But here's the secret that many people miss. The order matters, and the depth matters even more. Start with what and when, because these are typically the most concrete and verifiable, then move to where and who, then explore why and how, which require more analytical thinking and interpretation. Let me give you a real-world example. Imagine you're investigating why a company's quarterly sales dropped dramatically. An amateur might ask, "Why did sales drop?" and accept the first answer they hear. But a trained investigator would ask, "What specific products declined? When did the decline actually begin? Where did we lose market share? Who made the decisions that led to this decline? Why might customers be choosing competitors instead? And how did our competitors position themselves during this period?" Each answer leads to new questions, and this layering of inquiry is what creates genuine understanding rather than superficial assumptions. The second essential tip is what I call obsessive attention to detail, and this means training your brain to notice things that others walk past without a second glance. This isn't about being paranoid or obsessing over every tiny thing. It's about developing a specific kind of selective focus where you're tuned to notice inconsistencies, contradictions, patterns, and anomalies. The human brain is actually very good at this, but we've been trained by modern life to skim over details and move quickly from one thing to the next, which is why you need to deliberately retrain yourself to slow down and look carefully. Many famous investigators and detectives have talked about how a single detail that nobody else noticed became the thread that unraveled an entire case. Think about Sherlock Holmes, who notices dust patterns on a windowsill or slight variations in mud on a suspect's shoes. And while those are fictional examples, real investigators work exactly this way. When you're investigating something, take notes about everything you observe. Write down things that seem insignificant, because what seems insignificant might actually be the piece that connects to something else you've seen. For instance, if you're investigating a business issue, you might notice that every time a certain employee is scheduled for a meeting, projects seem to stall. Or you might notice that documentation for certain transactions is always slightly incomplete, or you might observe that communication about specific decisions always happens verbally rather than in writing. These details aren't necessarily proof of anything, but they're flags that suggest where you should dig deeper. I recommend creating a detailed observation log where you write down not just what happened, but also environmental factors, the exact words people used, their tone of voice, their body language, and even things that didn't happen but seemed like they should have happened. This creates a comprehensive record that you can analyze later and find patterns that weren't obvious in the moment. The third fundamental technique is what I call the verification spiral, and this means that you never, ever take a single source as truth. Instead, you treat every piece of information as a hypothesis that needs to be tested against multiple sources and perspectives. This is crucial because people are unreliable, memories are unreliable, documents can be forged or misinterpreted, and even well-intentioned sources can be mistaken about what they think they know. The verification spiral works like this. You gather initial information from one source, you identify what exactly you need to verify, you seek out independent confirmation from at least two other sources that haven't communicated with each other, you look for primary sources rather than relying on secondhand accounts, you check for documents or records that can corroborate the claims, and you remain alert to gaps or contradictions between sources. Let me illustrate this with an example. Suppose someone tells you that a contract was signed on January 15th. This is your initial information, but don't accept it as fact. Instead, verify it by checking the actual signed contract document. Verify it by looking at email correspondence from that date that references the signing. Verify it by speaking with at least two different people who were present, and verify it by checking any company records or digital systems that would have logged this event. If all these sources agree, you can feel confident about the date. But if you find a contradiction, like one person saying it was signed on January 15th, but the contract is dated January 17th and emails reference January 17th, then you've discovered something important that needs further investigation. The fourth crucial tip is developing expertise in what I call contextual understanding, which means that you can never truly understand something in isolation. You have to understand the broader context, the historical background, the social and economic factors, the political landscape, and the motivations of the people involved. Context transforms raw facts into meaningful information. For example, the same price increase might be normal in one context and suspicious in another. The same timeline might be reasonable in one industry and implausible in another. And the same behavior might be expected in one culture and shocking in another. When you're investigating, spend significant time learning about the field, industry, community, or subject matter that you're investigating. If you're investigating a medical situation, understand how the healthcare system works, what the standard protocols are, and what factors influence medical decisions. If you're investigating a financial matter, understand accounting principles, regulatory requirements, and industry norms. This contextual knowledge allows you to spot when something deviates from what should be expected, and deviations are often where the truth hides. A useful practice is to read widely in your area of investigation, talk to experts who have deep experience in that field, review case studies of similar situations, and understand the language and terminology that professionals in that area use. When you do this, you can recognize immediately when something sounds off, or when someone is misusing terminology, or when a situation doesn't fit the normal pattern. The fifth essential technique is what I call strategic documentation, and this means that you maintain detailed, organized records of everything you discover, how you discovered it, when you discovered it, and the sources of your information. Many amateur investigators gather information and then lose track of where it came from or when they learned it, which severely undermines the credibility of their investigation. You need a system where every piece of information can be traced back to its source, where you can demonstrate your methodology, and where you maintain complete transparency about your process. I recommend creating separate documents for different categories of information: raw data that you've collected, analysis that you've performed on that data, sources that you've consulted, questions that remain unanswered, contradictions or inconsistencies you found, and conclusions you're drawing with the supporting evidence for each conclusion. This documentation serves multiple purposes. It keeps you organized so you don't duplicate efforts or forget important details. It allows you to review your own work and catch errors or unsupported leaps in logic. It demonstrates to others that your investigation was conducted rigorously and scientifically, and it creates a record that can withstand scrutiny and criticism. When you present your findings to others, the quality and completeness of your documentation is what gives your conclusions credibility. The sixth important tip involves understanding bias and actively working to counter it. And this might be the most challenging aspect of investigation because bias is largely invisible to us. We all have biases, we all have assumptions, we all have beliefs that shape how we interpret information. And the more invested we are in a particular outcome, the more likely we are to unconsciously distort evidence to fit that outcome. Confirmation bias is particularly dangerous in investigations. It's the tendency to seek out information that confirms what you already believe, and to ignore or dismiss information that contradicts your beliefs. To fight this, you must deliberately seek out perspectives that challenge your current conclusions. You must actively look for evidence that contradicts your hypothesis. You must consider alternative explanations for everything you observe, and you must be willing to change your mind when the evidence demands it. A practical technique is to deliberately play devil's advocate with yourself. For every conclusion you're reaching, write out the strongest possible argument against that conclusion and take it seriously. For example, if you've concluded that someone is dishonest based on inconsistencies in their story, force yourself to write out the most charitable interpretation of their behavior. Could they be mistaken rather than deceptive? Could there be reasons they didn't remember things correctly? Could the inconsistencies be due to miscommunication rather than intentional deception? This isn't about reaching invalid conclusions, it's about making sure your conclusions are as solid as they can possibly be. The seventh technique is what I call pattern recognition across multiple domains, and this is where investigation becomes almost artistic because you're learning to see connections that others miss. Patterns often repeat across different scales and different contexts. Organizational patterns might mirror biological patterns. Social patterns might follow mathematical principles. Historical patterns might predict future developments. When you become good at recognizing patterns, you can see where something is likely to go before it gets there. For instance, if you're investigating organizational problems, understanding group dynamics from psychology, social dynamics from sociology, and system dynamics from complexity theory can all give you insights that a purely linear analysis might miss. The eighth and final tip that I want to share is the importance of controlled skepticism, which means that you doubt claims in a systematic and fair way, rather than either blindly believing everything or blindly disbelieving everything. Controlled skepticism means asking the question, what would convince me that this is true, or what would convince me that this is false? If you can't answer those questions, then you're not being skeptical in a productive way. You're either being credulous or you're being obstinately close-minded. With controlled skepticism, you evaluate claims based on the quality of evidence, the credibility of sources, the plausibility given what you know about how the world works, and the internal consistency of the narrative. When you apply these investigation tips and tricks in your own life and work, remember that investigation is fundamentally about curiosity, about refusing to accept easy answers, about having the intellectual courage to dig deeper, even when it's uncomfortable, and about maintaining the discipline to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts what you hoped to be true. The most successful investigators I've encountered share certain characteristics. They ask better questions than other people, they notice things that others miss, they verify information thoroughly, they understand context deeply, they document their process carefully, they actively fight their own biases, they recognize patterns that aren't obvious, and they maintain a balanced skepticism that's neither naive nor cynical. These skills aren't mysterious or magical, they're practical techniques that anyone can develop through deliberate practice and conscious effort. Start today by picking one of these techniques and deliberately applying it to a situation you're currently facing. Maybe it's a problem at work, maybe it's something you're trying to understand in your personal life, maybe it's a topic you're curious about. Apply one technique, notice what you discover, and then gradually add the others to your toolkit. Over time, these practices will become habitual, and you'll find that you naturally ask better questions, notice more details, seek out better sources, understand context more deeply, and reach conclusions that are more accurate and more reliable. Investigation is a skill that will serve you well for the rest of your life in ways you can't even predict right now, so invest in developing it seriously. And thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to exploring more topics like this soon.